Imagine a small town nestled among the lush forests and rolling hills of northern Florida, where the air was scented with cedar and the rhythm of daily life was slow and steady. This was Rosewood, founded in 1847, a place that would quietly grow into a tight-knit community with its own unique story. By the late 19th century, most of the town's white residents had moved on, drawn to other opportunities as local timber resources were exhausted. What remained was a predominantly black town, a rare sanctuary in an era when systemic racism shaped nearly every corner of American life. In Rosewood, black families built homes, ran businesses, and cultivated a sense of pride and resilience. They were farmers, craftsmen, mill workers, and community leaders who had carved out a place for themselves despite the social challenges of the time. While life outside their town often meant navigating the harsh realities of Jim Crow laws and discriminatory practices. Within Rosewood, there was a feeling of autonomy and possibility, a chance to live with dignity and security. But the story of Rosewood is not just about its peace and prosperity. It is also about history that too often remains hidden, the fragility of that peace, and the deep-seated tensions that could erupt in devastating ways. The town's calm streets and strong sense of community were built on resilience. But resilience alone could not shield them from the forces of injustice and prejudice that existed beyond their borders. Today, the memory of Rosewood stands as a testament to the courage and determination of those who lived there. Their stories remind us that history is not only shaped by dates and events, but also by the lives of ordinary people who dared to create communities of hope in the face of adversity. It is a history worth remembering, a history that deserves attention and respect. As we explore the story of Rosewood, we uncover lessons about strength, perseverance, and the human spirit. We see how a community, though threatened by the pressures of society and the prejudices of the time, strove to maintain its identity and dignity. And we are reminded that understanding these past events helps us appreciate the challenges and triumphs of communities today. If you are ready to dive deeper into this incredible story, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter in the history of Rosewood. Together, we can explore the untold stories, celebrate resilience, and honor the legacy of those who lived through remarkable times. Join us as we step into a piece of history, uncover the truths that shaped it, and reflect on the lessons it leaves for all of us. As Rosewood grew, it became more than just a quiet settlement tucked away in northern Florida. It became a community defined by its labor, ingenuity, and the shared lives of its residents. The town thrived on its abundant cedar forests, which had long provided the raw materials for pencil mills that dotted the region. These mills were modest in scale, yet they formed the backbone of Rosewood's economy, employing local families and sustaining a rhythm of work that gave structure to daily life. Timber was more than a resource. It was a lifeline, a thread that connected families to the land and to each other. The scent of freshly cut cedar permeated the town, mingling with the smoke from cookfires and the laughter of children playing along dusty lanes, creating a sensory tapestry that defined Rosewood for those who called it home. Despite its economic activity, Rosewood remained unincorporated, a place where governance was informal and the bonds of community carried far more weight than official titles or regulations. Decisions were made collectively. Disputes were settled through conversation rather than courts, and neighbors looked after one another with a sense of responsibility that felt almost familial. This structure allowed the town to cultivate a remarkable sense of peace and stability, particularly considering the social climate of the surrounding region. In an era where racial prejudice and segregation were deeply entrenched across the American South, Rosewood offered a rare space where black families could live, work, and raise children with a measure of autonomy and dignity. The town's lack of formal incorporation did not signify weakness. Rather, it reflected the resilience and resourcefulness of its residents, who had carved out a life defined by cooperation, enterprise, and cultural continuity. Life in Rosewood followed a rhythm shaped by both the cycles of nature and the demands of work. Mornings often began with the hum of saws in the mills and the calls of farmers tending their fields, while afternoons were filled with children running through shaded streets, their laughter blending with the distant clatter of tools and wagons. Local markets and gatherings were more than mere exchanges of goods. They were opportunities to reinforce social bonds, to share news, and to cultivate a collective identity rooted in shared experiences and mutual support. Evenings brought families together, whether round dinner tables or at community events, as the town's residents celebrated achievements, marked milestones, and offered comfort to those facing hardships. Through these routines, Rosewood became not just a place of survival, but a place of life, vibrancy, and meaning. The economic foundation of timber and pencil production also created pathways for social mobility within the town, allowing families to invest in homes, education, and land ownership. Black families in Rosewood were able to build legacies that extended beyond a single generation, establishing schools, churches, and small businesses that reinforced the town's cohesion and cultural identity. This thriving economic and social ecosystem made Rosewood an unusual but powerful example of what could be accomplished when a community worked together in the face of systemic challenges. It was a testament to human determination, illustrating that even in a society structured by inequities, pockets of self-determination and prosperity were possible. Yet, despite this sense of security, the tranquility of Rosewood was precarious, a delicate equilibrium that existed amid a broader society marked by inequality and prejudice. The town's unincorporated status, while allowing for self-governance, also meant that external protections were limited, leaving the community vulnerable to forces beyond its control. In the early 20th century, as racial tensions in the United States intensified, these vulnerabilities would become tragically evident. The very peace that Rosewood had cultivated over decades was susceptible to disruption, not from within, but from the prejudice, fear, and violence that permeated the world outside its boundaries. Nevertheless, for decades, the residents of Rosewood carried on, finding joy and purpose in daily life, building traditions, and nurturing children with the hope that their town could remain a haven. The combination of economic stability through timber and mills, social cohesion, and shared cultural identity fostered a strong sense of belonging. Rosewood was more than a geographic location. It was a living testament to resilience, ingenuity, and the human spirit. Its story at this time was not defined by tragedy, but by the quiet triumphs of ordinary people who, against the odds, created a life that was meaningful, sustainable, and filled with dignity. Understanding this period of Rosewood's history allows us to appreciate the depth of what was lost in the years that followed, to grasp how a community's achievements could be overshadowed by prejudice, and to recognize the extraordinary effort it took for Black families to build and sustain a town that functioned as a true sanctuary. It reminds us that history is not only measured in major events or dramatic upheavals, but also in the ordinary days of work, laughter, and human connection that collectively shape the identity and legacy of a place. If you are captivated by the story of Rosewood and want to uncover more about its residents, the lives they built, and the lessons hidden in their experiences, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell. Join us as we continue to explore the rich, complex, and inspiring history of Rosewood, a town whose story deserves to be remembered and whose spirit continues to resonate nearly a century later. even as the sun rose over the quiet streets of Rosewood, casting long shadows across the cedar-lined roads. The lives of its residents were shadowed by a reality that no amount of prosperity could erase. Slavery had been abolished decades earlier, yet the social structures and prejudices that had been built around it did not disappear overnight. The United States was a nation in transition, grappling with its identity in the wake of emancipation. But for black communities like Rosewood, progress was uneven and fragile. Beyond the fences of their homes, beyond the timber mills and pencil factories that sustained them, lay a world where systemic racism and white supremacy still governed daily life, dictating who could walk freely, who could speak safely, and who could trust in justice. Rosewood's residents were acutely aware that the freedoms they had fought for, and the lives they were building, existed within uneasy balance. The town itself, tucked away and largely self-governed, offered a reprieve from the hostility that permeated surrounding areas. But the threat of violence was never far away. Rumors, gossip, and unverified accusations could ignite anger among neighbors and outsiders alike. And in this tense atmosphere, the safety and stability of the town were never guaranteed. Even ordinary interactions carried a weight of caution. Children learned early how to navigate a world that did not value their lives equally, and parents instilled lessons of vigilance alongside lessons of pride and resilience. The paradox of Rosewood was that it represented both refuge and vulnerability. Within its borders, black families could cultivate land, operate businesses, and form close-knit social networks that reinforced their identity and solidarity. Outside, the wider society maintained laws, customs, and social expectations that reinforced a hierarchy built on race. White supremacy was not just a set of beliefs but a pervasive system that shaped employment, education, law enforcement, and social interactions, and it often manifested through acts of intimidation, discrimination, and violence. The echoes of this system reached even into a town that seemed isolated, reminding its residents that their accomplishments and sense of community existed in a fragile ecosystem of tolerance and fear. At the same time, the prosperity and cultural vibrancy of Rosewood became both a source of pride and a point of envy. A quiet reminder to neighboring communities of what black families could achieve when given autonomy and opportunity. This success, however, was often interpreted through the lens of prejudice, and admiration could quickly transform into suspicion or resentment. The very independence that allowed Rosewood to flourish also made it a target, for communities thriving against the odds could challenge the entrenched racial hierarchies that white supremacy sought to maintain. It was a delicate dance of progress and peril, one that required constant awareness and careful navigation of both opportunity and threat. Historical records from the early 20th century reveal that lynching, mob violence, and other racially motivated attacks were tragically common throughout the South. And Rosewood's residents lived with the knowledge that they were not immune to these dangers. Newspapers and word-of-mouth reports carried stories of injustice and brutality that reached their ears, and each account reinforced the reality that even the most peaceful communities were vulnerable to the anger and prejudice of outsiders. The systemic racism of the time was not only in laws or overt acts of violence. It was embedded in the assumptions, fears, and expectations of an entire society that measured human value by skin color. This context is critical to understanding the pressures that built quietly in Rosewood, pressures that would later explode in devastating ways. Yet within this environment, the people of Rosewood found ways to resist the pervasive narrative of inferiority imposed upon them. Churches became centers of education and civic engagement, local gatherings reinforced community cohesion, and families worked tirelessly to preserve knowledge, traditions, and a sense of pride that could not be legislated away. These acts of resilience were subtle yet profound, quietly defying a society that sought to limit possibilities based on race. Children were taught the importance of dignity and self-respect. Young adults learned the value of hard work and mutual support. And elders became the keepers of stories that reminded everyone of both the dangers and the potential of the world beyond their town. The tension between Rosewood's internal peace and the external threats of systemic racism would define much of the town's early history. It was a reality that shaped daily life in ways both visible and unseen, influencing decisions about business, travel, education, and even recreation. Every interaction with outsiders, every encounter beyond the town's borders, carried a subtle weight, and the cumulative effect was a heightened awareness of the fragility of safety and autonomy. This awareness, while burdensome, also cultivated a deep sense of solidarity, a shared understanding that the community's survival depended on vigilance, cooperation, and a commitment to protecting one another. By examining this period in Rosewood's history, we gain insight into the broader dynamics of early 20th century America, where the end of slavery did not mark the end of oppression, and freedom existed unevenly across racial lines. It reminds us that progress is often conditional, fragile, uncontested, and that the achievements of marginalized communities are hard-won against persistent social barriers. The story of Rosewood at this time is a testament to both the dangers of entrenched prejudice and the extraordinary resilience of people determined to create a life of dignity in spite of it. If you are intrigued by the story of Rosewood and want to explore the challenges and triumphs of its residents further, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you can follow every chapter of this incredible journey. Join us as we uncover the lives, the struggles, and the resilience that defined a town that sought peace in a world shaped by systemic injustice. And let us reflect on the lessons it leaves for all of us today. The calm and resilience that had defined Rosewood for decades was shattered on the first day of 1923. A day that would mark the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in its history. Frances Fannie Taylor, a young white woman living in the nearby town of Suwannee, became the unwitting catalyst for a storm that would descend upon the peaceful community. On that morning, what began as a private matter between two adults, an affair hidden behind closed doors, was transformed into a public accusation that would unleash the worst fears and prejudices of the surrounding communities. Fannie, seeking to protect herself from scandal and potential repercussions, claimed that she had been assaulted by a black man, a falsehood that immediately ignited the tinderbox of racial tension that had been quietly simmering throughout the region for years. The consequences of that single accusation would ripple outward, touching every corner of Rosewood and changing the town's history forever. The context in which Fannie made her claim is critical to understanding why it had such catastrophic consequences. By 1923, Rosewood was a predominantly black town, a community that had grown and thrived on the labor of its residents, on timber and pencil mills, and on the strength of relationships built over decades. Its success and relative autonomy, while a source of pride, also made it a target in a society where racial hierarchies were fiercely enforced and white supremacy shaped every aspect of public life. In the eyes of many white residents in neighboring towns, the presence of a prosperous black community was perceived not as a testament to hard work and cooperation, but as a challenge to the social order they had long taken for granted. It was within this charged atmosphere that Fannie's allegation, though baseless, became a spark capable of igniting a conflagration of fear, suspicion, and violence. On that cold January morning, Fannie's report traveled quickly through Suwannee, carried by neighbors, acquaintances, and local authorities. The story she presented was simple yet explosive. She claimed that a black man had entered her home and attacked her, though she did not provide a specific name. The combination of her account and the existing racial prejudices of the time created a perfect storm. In the absence of careful investigation, assumptions were made, and the collective imagination of the community filled in the gaps with fear-driven conclusions. White residents, already conditioned to see black men as threats, interpreted her statement as confirmation of their own biases, and what should have been a private and unverified incident escalated into a matter of communal outrage. As word spread, the search for a supposed culprit began. It did not take long for the rumor of an escaped convict named Jess Hunter, a black man who had fled a nearby prison chain gang just days before, to intertwine with Fanny's story. The convergence of her false accusation and the panic surrounding Hunter's escape gave white residents a tangible target, someone upon whom they could project their fear and rage. Fueled by the notion of protecting their own, a growing mob began to assemble, ready to act on the assumption that justice could only be delivered through their own hands. This was not merely a matter of curiosity or concern. It was a reflection of the systemic racism that had long been normalized, a willingness to enforce perceived social hierarchies through intimidation and violence without evidence or due process. Meanwhile, in Rosewood, the residents had no inkling of the approaching storm. Families continued with their daily routines, tending to mills, farms, and households, unaware that the quiet rhythm of life they had cultivated was about to be violently interrupted. When the first signs of the mob's arrival appeared, confusion and fear swept through the town. The black men and women of Rosewood understood immediately what was happening, not only because of the intensity of the mob, but because they had lived with the constant knowledge that racial prejudice could erupt at any moment. They had experienced the cautious watchfulness required to survive in a society that often devalued their lives. And yet, nothing could have fully prepared them for the scale and ferocity of what was coming. Fanny's false accusation was not merely a personal lie. It became a societal weapon, a justification for aggression that extended far beyond her own situation. What might have been an isolated incident in another context became the pretext for collective punishment. As hundreds of white men from surrounding areas converged on Rosewood with the intention of exacting revenge on a community whose only crime was its existence and independence. The irony of the situation was bitterly clear. The actual events of that morning, a private affair between Fanny and another white man, were irrelevant to the mob. Their actions were dictated not by evidence or truth, but by the entrenched belief in black inferiority and the readiness to act violently upon mere suspicion. As the hours passed, the town that had long symbolized resilience and prosperity began to face unimaginable destruction. Homes were invaded, families threatened, and lives put at risk as fear and prejudice took on a physical, terrifying form. Individuals such as Sam Carter and Sylvester Carrier, who would later stand in defense of their neighbors, were suddenly cast into roles dictated not by choice but by the urgent need to protect their community. The chaos that ensued was a direct consequence of Fanny's decision to conceal the truth, and the societal structures that allowed such an accusation to carry catastrophic weight. The events that began on January 1, 1923, remind us how personal actions can intersect with systemic prejudice to produce devastating outcomes. What might have been a private story of human frailty transformed into a public tragedy because it resonated with existing fears, biases, and assumptions, amplified by the power of rumor and the willingness of a community to act on prejudice rather than fact. In the case of Rosewood, a single false claim illuminated the fragility of peace, the persistent dangers of racial injustice, and the ways in which truth can be twisted to serve the convenience of those seeking to maintain social hierarchies. If you want to understand more about how this single day set into motion a chain of events that would forever change Rosewood, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell so you can follow the full story. By exploring these events, we honor the memories of those affected and gain a deeper understanding of the human consequences of prejudice, rumor, and unchecked power. As news of Francis Taylor's accusations spread like wildfire through Suwannee and the surrounding towns, fear and anger coalesced into a storm of collective outrage, transforming ordinary citizens into a mob driven by prejudice and rumor. The narrative of a black man assaulting a white woman, though entirely unverified, tapped into deep-seated fears and biases that had been simmering for decades. And in the charged atmosphere of early 20th century Florida, it did not take much to ignite the flames of collective hysteria. By the time the story reached Rosewood and its neighbors, it had morphed from a single accusation into a tale of imminent threat. A narrative in which the community believed that a fugitive named Jess Hunter, a black man recently escaped from a chain gang, had committed the crime. The combination of Fanny Sly and the specter of an escaped convict created the perfect storm, compelling around 400 white men from Suwannee, Otter Creek, Bronson, and Chiefland to gather and mobilize. Each man arrived with his own assumptions, with his own fears amplified by the collective energy of the group, and together they became a force that would descend upon Rosewood with catastrophic consequences. The sheer scale of the mobilization is staggering when considered in the context of the time. These men were not organized soldiers or law enforcement officers in the modern sense. They were neighbors, farmers, laborers, and tradesmen, ordinary people whose lives until that morning had been defined by work and family. Now swept up by rumor and racial animosity, they carried weapons, dogs, and an unquestioned conviction that their presence was justified, that their actions were necessary to protect the moral and social order as they understood it. The idea that such a large, armed group could assemble so quickly illustrates both the pervasive fear of black autonomy and the efficiency with which rumor could mobilize a community steeped in racial prejudice. The logic of the mob was simple yet deadly. An accusation was sufficient evidence, and collective action was the only means to enforce justice. However imagined, from the outset, the dynamics of the mob were chaotic and terrifying. Orders and plans were informal at best, guided less by strategy and more by instinct, rumor, and the contagious energy of mass action. Dogs were brought along to track scents. Firearms were loaded, and each man anticipated confrontation, believing that they were pursuing a dangerous criminal. In reality, the target of their wrath, Jess Hunter, was not even present in Rosewood, and the accusation itself was false. A misdirection that illustrates how easily fear and bias can warp perception and justify violence. The irony is bitterly clear. The community's determination to enforce what they saw as justice relied entirely on assumptions, and their actions were predicated on lies, rumor, and unverified suspicion. For the residents of Rosewood, the arrival of the mob transformed everyday life into a landscape of terror. Families who had lived peacefully for decades found themselves under siege, with no official protection beyond the informal leadership and courage of their own community members. Men and women who had never committed a crime were suddenly targets, suspected solely because of the color of their skin and the proximity of their homes to the supposed perpetrator. The presence of hundreds of armed men, bolstered by the societal legitimacy of racial hierarchy, created a situation in which survival required ingenuity, courage, and sometimes the impossible calculation of how to defend one's family without incurring further wrath. Amid the chaos, a few figures emerged as defenders and protectors. Individuals like Sam Carter and Sylvester Carrier, whose knowledge of the town and determination to protect their neighbors became a lifeline for many. They understood that the mob's belief in its own righteousness made negotiation nearly impossible, and that any act perceived as resistance could provoke immediate violence. Yet, rather than fleeing entirely, they attempted to shield the most vulnerable, families to safe spaces, hiding children beneath beds and mattresses, and preparing to confront the mob when necessary. Their courage was a testament to the resilience and solidarity that had long defined Rosewood, a stark counterpoint to the fear-driven aggression of the outsiders. The mob itself, however, was unstoppable in its momentum. As the group moved through Rosewood and its surrounding areas, homes were invaded, possessions destroyed, and residents terrorized. The search for Jess Hunter became a pretext for broader violence, a mechanism through which long-simmering racial resentments found expression in acts of intimidation, brutality, and murder. Individuals were seized not because of evidence but because of proximity, visibility, or suspicion. And the combination of mass hysteria and deeply ingrained prejudice created a scenario in which the rules of justice were entirely subverted. What began as an accusation against a single person metastasized into a collective punishment against an entire community, illustrating the horrifying capacity of rumor and systemic bias to generate widespread tragedy. Even the law, represented by the local sheriff and deputies, struggled to contain the chaos. Attempts to restrain the mob or direct their actions were largely ineffective, for the energies and size of the crowd overwhelmed official authority. In this environment, decisions about life and death were made not in courts or through evidence, but in the streets, on intuition, and by the momentum of collective fear. The entire episode demonstrates how societal structures and individual prejudice can converge to create a perfect storm of injustice, in which ordinary people are transformed into agents of destruction without deliberation or accountability. The events of early January 1923 reveal the intersection of personal deceit, systemic racism, and collective violence. Fannie Taylor's false accusation, amplified by rumor and entrenched white supremacy, created the preconditions for the mobilization of 400 men who believed themselves to be delivering justice, yet who in reality became perpetrators of chaos and terror. The tragedy that unfolded was not an isolated event but part of a continuum of racialized violence, a stark reminder that the mechanisms of fear, rumor, and prejudice can escalate quickly into overwhelming social force. If you want to understand more about how this massive mobilization of men led to the events that forever changed Rosewood, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell to follow the full story. By examining these moments, we honor the resilience of those who defended their community and learn vital lessons about the dangers of rumor, fear, and unchecked prejudice. As the mob descended upon Rosewood, the town's serene streets, which had for decades been filled with the sounds of daily life, children playing, hammers striking at the mill, neighbors exchanging greetings, were transformed into a theater of terror. The air thick with smoke, shouts, and the unmistakable stench of fear. What began as a search for a supposed fugitive quickly morphed into a campaign of indiscriminate violence, a manifestation of deep-seated prejudice and unchecked rage. Ordinary black families who had lived peacefully, tended to their businesses, and nurtured their children now found themselves facing a force of destruction they could neither reason with nor escape from easily. Each house became a potential site of tragedy, each door a possible portal to unimaginable horror. Within this chaos, the figures of Rosewood's defenders emerged, brave men and women who stood their ground despite knowing the odds were stacked against them. Sam Carter, a respected blacksmith and community figure, became one of the first targets of the mob, not for any crime he had committed, but because he was known, because he was black, and because proximity and circumstance had placed him in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sam's experience was both brutal and emblematic of the indiscriminate cruelty of the mob. Dragged from the relative safety of his home, he was tortured in an attempt to force him to admit knowledge of Jess Hunter's whereabouts. Threatened, beaten, and ultimately shot, His life was taken in a violent display meant to instill fear in all who remained. His death was not an isolated incident, but a signal to the entire community that innocence was no shield against prejudice, and that being black in a world dominated by white supremacy could render one defenseless in the face of collective hatred. Alongside Sam, families were not spared. Women, and even children, were caught in the storm. Homes were invaded without warrant or reason. Possessions were destroyed, and people were either forcibly removed, attacked, or killed, their only transgression being the color of their skin and the simple fact of their residence in a prosperous black community. The tactics of the mob were calculated to terrorize as much as to punish. Some residents were shot or beaten as a warning to others, while others were subjected to humiliation or forced to witness the brutal treatment of neighbors before being allowed to flee. The mob's actions were as much about spectacle as about violence, designed to send a clear message that resistance would be met with overwhelming force. Yet amidst the chaos, acts of courage and solidarity illuminated the darkness. Individuals like Sylvester Carrier and other members of the community sought to protect those most vulnerable, hiding children beneath beds and mattresses, directing families to safe rooms, and standing guard when the mob attempted to break through doors. Their courage demonstrated that even in the face of overwhelming odds, human resilience and solidarity could manifest, creating pockets of safety and defiance amid widespread destruction. The violence, however, was relentless. It swept through Rosewood like a wildfire, leaving scorched homes, shattered windows, and terrified families in its wake. People were killed simply for being present, for being seen, or for resisting in any way. The standoff at the home of Sarah Carrier, where approximately 25 black residents, including children, had taken refuge, exemplified the horror of the day. Sarah herself was shot as she attempted to protect the children and her family. Her death a cruel testament to the lengths the mob would go to enforce their imagined justice. Sylvester Carrier, who had armed himself in defense, fought back against the invaders, but the night ended with both defenders and innocents dead or injured, and the town beginning to feel the irreversible weight of destruction. The indiscriminate nature of the violence left the community in disarray. By the morning of January 5th, homes were burnt, families scattered, and the population of Rosewood decimated. Survivors emerged from hiding to witness the extent of the devastation. Neighborhoods leveled, livelihoods destroyed, and a once thriving town left in ruins. While official reports recorded a lower number of casualties, eyewitness accounts and historical research suggest that the true toll was far higher. A grim reminder of how systemic racism and mob violence often silence the voices and lives of those most affected. The targeting of Sam Carter, Sylvester Carrier, and countless other individuals highlights a pattern repeated across history, where the innocent are punished to reinforce social hierarchies, and fear becomes the mechanism through which oppression is maintained. Beyond the physical destruction, the emotional and psychological toll was immense. Families were torn apart, trust within the community was fractured, and survivors were left to rebuild not only their homes but also their sense of safety and identity. The trauma of witnessing loved ones killed, of seeing neighbors tortured, and of experiencing such direct violence left scars that would ripple through generations. Yet even in this horror, the courage, resourcefulness, and solidarity of Rosewood's residents shone through, serving as enduring examples of human resilience in the face of deliberate, systemic cruelty. The events of that day serve as a stark lesson on the destructive power of unchecked prejudice, rumor, and collective violence. They remind us that when fear and hatred are allowed to dictate action, entire communities can be devastated, and that injustice can occur not because of truth or wrongdoing, but because of the color of someone's skin and the assumptions of those in power. The attacks on Sam Carter and other residents exemplify the fragility of justice in an environment dominated by systemic racism, where even the innocent can become targets for collective retribution. If you want to follow the full story of Rosewood and understand how its residents faced unimaginable violence while exhibiting extraordinary courage, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell. By exploring these events, we honor the memory of those who suffered, acknowledge the resilience of those who fought to protect their community, and learn the profound lessons about the consequences of prejudice, rumor, and unchecked power. As the sun rose on the second day of the violence that had engulfed Rosewood, the chaos that had begun with a single false accusation continued to unfold with a cruel and merciless intensity, leaving no corner of the town untouched by fear, destruction, and grief. Among the defenders of the community, Sylvester Carrier emerged as a figure whose courage and determination would become a symbol of resistance in the face of overwhelming odds. A man intimately familiar with the rhythms of Rosewood, Sylvester understood that survival would demand more than quiet endurance. It would require proactive protection, strategic thinking, and the willingness to confront a mob whose numbers and rage were seemingly unstoppable. When the white mob turned its attention to the home of Sarah Carrier, aware that her house sheltered some of the town's most vulnerable, including children, Sylvester did not hesitate to step forward. His presence provided a semblance of organization and defense in an otherwise chaotic scenario, as dozens of families sought refuge in a space that had been transformed from a home into a fortress of last resort. Inside Sarah Carrier's modest house, around 25 people, including small children who had been hidden beneath beds, inside closets, and beneath mattresses, waited in tense silence, clinging to one another for reassurance as the sounds of destruction outside drew closer. Sylvester, armed and prepared to defend the residents, coordinated with a few other able-bodied men who remained, understanding that the odds were grim but that every action might preserve lives. Their strategy was simple but vital. Maintain cover, resist entry when possible, and by allowing those who were most vulnerable, particularly the children, to survive. Despite their efforts, the mob's relentless aggression and sheer numbers quickly became apparent, illustrating the frightening reality that courage and planning could only achieve so much against the force of hundreds of armed, prejudiced individuals united by rumor, fear, and white supremacy. The attack on Sarah Carrier's home was swift and brutal, as the mob forced its way inside, firing weapons indiscriminately and striking with sheer force. Sylvester and his allies engaged as best they could, attempting to shield the women and children from harm. Every shot fired, every door kicked in, and every scream that pierced the air became a part of the terrifying tableau, marking the transition from mere threat to indiscriminate assault. Sarah Carrier, who had dedicated herself to the care and protection of her family and neighbors, became one of the first casualties, struck down as she tried to maintain a protective shield around the children. Her death underscored the merciless logic of the mob. No one was spared, and the very act of resistance could invite fatal consequences. The children, hidden beneath the few makeshift barricades that could be constructed within the home, witnessed the violence unfold, their fear palpable, their safety precarious despite the best efforts of their protectors. Sylvester Carrier himself was drawn into direct confrontation, trading shots and using his knowledge of the house and its surroundings to delay the mob. He understood that time was the only asset available to him, that each second he could hold the invaders at bay increased the likelihood that some families might survive. Reports indicate that Sylvester's resistance momentarily slowed the mob's advance, creating pockets of reprieve where families could attempt to remain concealed or escape through secondary exits. Yet, the sheer scale of the assault made it impossible to defend all at once. And despite the bravery exhibited by Sylvester and his allies, many were struck down before they could be evacuated or protected. The house itself became a battlefield, every corner a potential site of danger, every room a scene of tension and dread, a stark illustration of how systemic racial hatred could transform domestic spaces into zones of life or death conflict. Beyond the immediate physical danger, the psychological weight of the event cannot be understated. Children, some no older than 10, were forced to listen to the sounds of destruction, the shouts of aggressors, and the cries of those injured or dying around them. Families huddled together, grasping one another in an attempt to maintain composure, while Sylvester and the other defenders bore the unimaginable responsibility of confronting mortal danger with no guarantee of success. Their courage was not abstract, it was concrete, immediate, and terrifyingly real, each action carrying the potential to save lives or precipitate further tragedy. The mixture of fear and resolve demonstrated the extraordinary resilience of the community, as ordinary individuals confronted extraordinary violence with both strategy and desperation. As the standoff continued, it became clear that the attacker's goal was not merely to punish a supposed criminal, but to obliterate the black community itself, to enforce social and racial hierarchies through terror. The indiscriminate killings, the targeted destruction of property, and the ruthless disregard for life underscored that the attack on Sarah Carrier's home was emblematic of the broader campaign to terrorize and ultimately drive black residents from Rosewood. Historical accounts suggest that while Sylvester and his allies may have delayed the worst of the violence, they were ultimately unable to prevent fatalities, and the losses within the home represented a microcosm of the devastation sweeping across the town. The courage of Sylvester Carrier and the efforts to protect the residents, especially the children, leave a lasting impression of human bravery and moral fortitude. Even in the face of near insurmountable odds, their actions remind us that even in moments of extreme injustice, there exist individuals who stand against cruelty and seek to uphold human dignity, risking life and limb in the process. Yet, the tragic outcome also emphasizes the destructive consequences of rumor, prejudice, and mob mentality, revealing how quickly lies and fear can escalate into devastating violence, especially when societal norms validate such actions. To truly understand the story of Rosewood, and the heroism and tragedy contained within, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Following the full narrative allows us not only to honor those who stood in defense of the vulnerable, but also to reflect on the critical lessons about courage, solidarity, and the ongoing need to confront prejudice and injustice in every form. As the violence in Rosewood stretched over days, the town that had once been a quiet haven of black prosperity and community became unrecognizable, transformed into a landscape of devastation, smoke, and mourning that would forever mark its history. Streets that had been lined with the homes of families, each filled with the ordinary rhythms of life, children laughing, neighbors exchanging greetings, the hum of mills in the distance, were now scarred with the blackened remnants of fire, shattered windows, and the echoes of screams that seemed to hang in the air like an oppressive cloud. The assault was methodical in its cruelty, yet chaotic in execution. No home, no family, and no individual seemed exempt from the terror that gripped the settlement. White mobs, fueled by racial hatred, misinformation, and a collective sense of perceived entitlement, roamed the streets, seeking out any black resident they could find, turning a simple search for a supposed fugitive into a campaign of annihilation that spared neither age nor gender. Women and children alike were subjected to beatings, shootings, and even lynchings, with reports indicating that the casualties numbered far beyond official tallies. Some historians estimating that more than 100 black residents may have lost their lives in what became one of the most horrific episodes of racial violence in American history. The destruction of property was as relentless as the targeting of people. Homes that had been meticulously maintained, filled with the warmth of family life and the possessions that signified decades of labor and care, were set ablaze with little regard for human attachment or history. Each fire served a dual purpose: to terrorize the remaining residents and to erase the tangible presence of black success and community from the landscape. Shops, mills, and places of gathering were reduced to rubble, severing economic lifelines and leaving survivors not only with grief for lost loved ones, but with the overwhelming challenge of rebuilding lives in the aftermath of such comprehensive destruction. The deliberate targeting of property mirrored the indiscriminate targeting of individuals. Just as homes were burned without consideration for ownership or merit, people were attacked for nothing beyond the accident of their skin color and their presence in a town that had become a symbol of black autonomy. Amid this relentless terror, acts of courage and resistance flickered like fragile flames. Survivors and defenders attempted to shield one another, to hide children beneath beds and in secret spaces, and to negotiate whatever reprieve they could from a mob whose rage seemed inexhaustible. Figures such as Sylvester Carrier, who had taken up arms to protect those in the most immediate danger, exemplified the extraordinary bravery that ordinary people can summon when confronted with extraordinary peril. Yet even these acts of heroism could not fully mitigate the overwhelming force and number of the attackers. The scale of the destruction and the loss of life underscored a grim reality. In an environment dominated by systemic racism and unchecked mob aggression, survival often depended on nothing more than sheer luck, strategic concealment, and the fleeting capacity of human courage to hold back a tide of violence. The toll of the massacre extended far beyond the immediate physical devastation. The psychological and emotional impact on survivors was profound and enduring. Families who lost loved ones were left to grieve not only the violent deaths, but also the obliteration of their homes and communities. Children, some as young as 5 or 6, were forced to bear witness to acts of cruelty and death that no human should ever endure, their innocence shattered in an instant. For those who survived, the process of mourning and rebuilding was compounded by the pervasive social dynamics that had enabled such violence in the first place. The fear and trauma instilled by the events in Rosewood would reverberate through generations, shaping the narratives of families who had once called the town home and leaving a legacy of caution and sorrow that could not easily be erased. Historical accounts reveal that the number of deaths and the extent of the destruction were deliberately minimized in contemporary reports. The official tally of black casualties, often recorded at around 20, failed to reflect eyewitness testimonies and later research that suggested the real figure was far higher, potentially exceeding 100. This deliberate underreporting served to obscure the truth, to protect perpetrators, and to prevent the full gravity of the massacre from entering the broader public consciousness. Yet over time, as survivors and historians pieced together events, the scale of the tragedy became undeniable, exposing both the cruelty of the mob and the systemic failures that allowed such violence to occur with impunity. The obliteration of Rosewood was not merely a physical event, but a symbolic act of racial terror, designed to reinforce societal hierarchies and instill fear within black communities far beyond the town itself. It demonstrated the capacity for rumor, prejudice, and collective anger to escalate into mass violence, with devastating consequences for innocent people who had done nothing to warrant such treatment. The attack highlighted the fragility of safety and justice for marginalized communities in the early 20th century and serves as a stark reminder of the destructive power of unchecked racial animus. Today, remembering the events in Rosewood is essential not only to honor the memory of those who perished, but also to confront the enduring legacies of racism and violence in society. By examining the lived experiences of survivors, understanding the chain of events that led to the town's destruction, and acknowledging the human cost of prejudice, we gain insight into the resilience, courage, and dignity of the Black community in the face of unimaginable adversity. This reflection compels us to bear witness, to educate, and to ensure that such acts of violence are neither forgotten nor repeated. If you want to learn more about the tragic history of Rosewood and explore the stories of those who lived, fought, and, in many cases, died during this dark chapter, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. By engaging with these stories, we honor the resilience of the victims, acknowledge the courage of those who resisted, and remind ourselves of the enduring lessons about justice, community, and the necessity of confronting prejudice wherever it exists. In the aftermath of the devastating events that tore through Rosewood, the truth of what had transpired became one of the most closely guarded secrets in the annals of American history, obscured not only by the immediate terror of the massacre itself, but also by decades of deliberate misrepresentation, misinformation, and cultural silence. The media of the time, largely controlled by white perspectives and influenced by prevailing prejudices, minimized the scale and severity of the violence, reporting only fragmentary details while glossing over the human toll. Headlines focused on the supposed justification for the mob's actions rather than the overwhelming tragedy that had unfolded, framing the narrative in a way that absolved perpetrators of accountability and shifted attention away from the systemic racial animus that had fueled the massacre. The town's destruction, the lives lost, and the suffering endured by survivors were reduced to footnotes, leaving a distorted historical record that would take decades to correct. For those who lived through the terror, this erasure compounded their pain, as the world outside remained largely ignorant of the scale of the atrocity and the injustice it represented, a silence that both isolated survivors and perpetuated the notion that violence against Black communities could be ignored without consequence. Beneath the surface of public narratives, the real cause of the massacre remained hidden, a fact for decades went unacknowledged. The violence that erupted in Rosewood did not stem from a random act of crime committed by a Black man, but rather from a white woman's clandestine affair with another white man. Frances Fannie Taylor, whose name would become infamous in historical accounts of the events, had sought to conceal her relationship, which, if revealed, would have brought personal scandal and social condemnation in a deeply conservative, segregated society. To deflect attention and avoid scrutiny, she blamed the assault she claimed to have suffered on an anonymous Black man, a decision that unleashed a catastrophic chain of events. The lie, simple in its articulation but monstrous in its consequences, catalyzed the violent mobilization of hundreds of white residents who, driven by a mixture of racial prejudice, collective rage, and societal conditioning, descended upon Rosewood with lethal intent. The truth of her motives, personal shame, and the desire to conceal her affair remained invisible to the outside world, hidden beneath layers of rumor, fear, and the prevailing assumptions of white supremacy. For decades, the silence around the real instigator of the violence allowed myths and falsehoods to solidify in public consciousness. Survivors' testimonies were often discounted or ignored, overshadowed by dominant narratives that framed Black residents as dangerous or culpable, while newspapers and official records painted the town's destruction as a regrettable but understandable response to a purported crime. The real story, that a white woman's deceit had ignited one of the deadliest racial attacks of the early 20th century, was largely concealed, its revelation considered too scandalous or inconvenient for the social climate of the era. Even as some individuals within the region knew the truth, fear of reprisal. Social ostracism or disbelief prevented widespread dissemination, ensuring that the massacre's underlying cause remained buried beneath decades of silence. Distortion and denial. It was only through persistent research, the oral histories preserved by survivors and their descendants, and the tireless work of historians that the hidden reality of Rosewood began to emerge. Interviews with families who had lost members, cross-examinations of local records, and careful reconstruction of events from multiple perspectives revealed the chain of misunderstandings, racial hatred, and calculated concealment that had escalated a personal lie into a public catastrophe. The realization that the massacre had been instigated not by the actions of a black man, but by the deliberate falsehood of a white woman reframed the entire historical understanding of Rosewood, exposing the layers of systemic injustice, societal complicity, and the destructive power of prejudice when combined with rumor and unchallenged authority. Understanding the concealment of the massacre's true cause also illuminates broader patterns of historical erasure and distortion. Rosewood was not an isolated incident. It represents a recurring theme in American history, where narratives are often shaped to protect certain groups while marginalizing or erasing the experiences of others. By examining the mechanisms through which the real story was suppressed through media bias, social fear, and the selective preservation of official records, we gain insight into how history itself can be manipulated, reminding us of the necessity to critically evaluate sources, seek out multiple perspectives, and remain vigilant against the repetition of such distortions. The story of Rosewood challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about how societal power dynamics and individual decisions can intersect to produce catastrophe. It is a testament to the human cost of deceit and prejudice, and a stark reminder that even small lies, when amplified by systemic injustice and collective bias, can escalate into large-scale tragedy. The concealment of the massacre's cause for decades underscores the importance of transparency, accountability, and historical honesty, illustrating that understanding the past fully requires digging beneath surface narratives, listening to marginalized voices, and acknowledging truths that may challenge long-held assumptions or societal comforts. As we reflect on the lessons of Rosewood, we are compelled to honor the memory of those who suffered, to recognize the bravery of those who resisted, and to understand the profound consequences of prejudice left unchecked. This chapter of history is a call to action for education, empathy, and the relentless pursuit of truth, ensuring that the experiences of those affected are remembered accurately and with dignity. By learning and sharing these truths, we safeguard against the repetition of such tragedies and affirm the value of justice and integrity in our collective historical consciousness. If you found this story meaningful and want to continue uncovering the truths behind overlooked chapters of history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that challenges, educates, and inspires. Through remembering, sharing, and reflecting, we ensure that the voices of Rosewood and those like it continue to resonate across generations, teaching us not only about the past but about our responsibility to a more just and compassionate future. As we draw this story of Rosewood to a close, it is important to reflect on the deeper lessons this tragic chapter in history offers. The Rosewood Massacre is not simply an isolated event in a forgotten town. It is a stark illustration of the systemic racism that permeated early 20th century America, a society in which the color of one's skin could determine not only social standing but life and death itself. In Rosewood, we see how entrenched prejudices, compounded by the widespread belief in white superiority, created an environment where lies could escalate into catastrophic violence. The false accusation leveled by Frances Fannie Taylor against an innocent black man set in motion a series of events that revealed the fragility of safety for black communities. Even decades after the abolition of slavery, it was a vivid demonstration of how systemic oppression is reinforced not only through laws and institutions, but also through the everyday assumptions, fears, and biases held by ordinary people. A reminder that racism is not only an abstract social concept, but a lived reality with devastating consequences. The massacre also exposes the perilous nature of mob mentality. When rumors spread unchecked, fear and anger became collective forces, transforming individuals into participants in atrocities they may never have committed independently. Hundreds of white residents gathered, driven by perceived duty, vengeance, and prejudice, and the result was indiscriminate violence, torture, and death. Women and children were all vulnerable, and the destruction of Rosewood's homes and businesses underscored how quickly humanity can be overwhelmed by fear, rumor, and collective rage. In examining the chain of events, we confront the uncomfortable truth that ordinary people can become instruments of cruelty when social pressures, misinformation, and deeply ingrained biases converge. This is a cautionary tale that resonates beyond its time and place, reminding us of the importance of critical thinking, empathy, and vigilance against groupthink that dehumanizes others. Equally significant is the erasure of history that followed the massacre. For decades, the story of Rosewood was marginalized, misrepresented, or entirely omitted from public records, with survivors' testimonies suppressed and the real causes of the violence obscured. The media downplayed the scale of the atrocity, framing it in ways that protected the perpetrators and perpetuated myths that falsely justified the attacks. The concealment of the white woman's affair as the actual catalyst, coupled with the deliberate minimization of the massacre's death toll, reveals how history can be manipulated, selectively recorded, and weaponized to maintain social hierarchies. Understanding Rosewood requires not only remembering the lives lost and the community destroyed, but also recognizing how systemic erasure contributes to ongoing marginalization of black experiences. It teaches us that history is never neutral. It is written, interpreted, and remembered through lenses of power, and acknowledging suppressed truths is essential for justice, reconciliation, and cultural memory. Yet, amid this darkness, the courage and resilience of Rosewood's residents shine through. Individuals like Sylvester Carrier, who stood in defense of their neighbors, and Sarah Carrier, who hid children and sought to protect her family, demonstrate extraordinary bravery in the face of overwhelming violence. These acts of resistance, though tragically not always successful in preventing death, reveal the enduring human capacity for courage, community, and moral fortitude. They remind us that even in moments of profound injustice, individuals have the power to act with integrity, to protect others, and to resist oppression, leaving a legacy that can inspire generations to come. The story of Rosewood is not just a cautionary tale of the past, it is a call to action for the present. It asks us to confront racism in all its forms, to critically examine the narratives we accept, and to work against the erasure of marginalized histories. By remembering and sharing the experiences of Rosewood's victims and survivors, we honor their lives and ensure that the lessons of the past are not forgotten. We are reminded that justice is not only about legal accountability, but also about acknowledgement, remembrance, and the willingness to learn from history to create a more equitable society. The massacre illustrates the human cost of hatred and prejudice, and it challenges us to commit to a future where communities are protected, diversity is valued, and collective responsibility is exercised with compassion rather than fear. In conclusion, the Rosewood Massacre is a powerful and sobering reminder of the destructive consequences of systemic racism, unchecked mob violence, and historical erasure. It teaches us about the fragility of social trust when fear and prejudice prevail, the moral dangers inherent in collective anger, and the importance of preserving and honoring the histories of marginalized communities. By learning from Rosewood, we are called to engage in active remembrance, to educate ourselves and others, and to cultivate a society where justice, empathy, and accountability guide our interactions. Thank you for joining me in exploring this vital, though painful, chapter of history. If you found this video informative and meaningful, please give it a thumbs up, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more content that delves into overlooked stories and uncovers the truths that shape our understanding of history. Your support helps keep these narratives alive and ensures that the lessons of Rosewood continue to resonate for future generations. Good night, and may we all strive to remember, learn, and act with greater awareness and humanity.